Something I used to do a lot of, and less so these days, is anxiety and trauma dumping. And we neurodivergents do this for a variety of reasons. First of all, high rates of anxiety as a whole among our population. We're more likely to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and to struggle with it as a result. And we might not often have the skills to manage that anxiety, to self-regulate, because we don't necessarily get taught those skills, and we're not offered co-regulation because we're excluded for being neurodivergent. Which brings me to my next point. High rates of complex trauma because we are a marginalized member of society. We are judged, punished, excluded, ostracized, bullied because of our differences, because we don't show up in the way that neurotypicals want us to show up. We don't fit within the narrow bounds of what's considered normal in our society. And there's a lot of social pressure to conform. And we bear the scars of that constant pressure and that feeling of inadequacy, shame, and defectiveness that dogs us as a result of those experiences. And we are also more predisposed to have attachment difficulties because we didn't have stable attachment experiences from our caregivers. This could be for a variety of reasons, but it tends to be observed in marginalized populations, high rates of insecure attachment. And it could be the pressures of minority identities. Minority stress is what it's been referred to as. And that minority stress can make maybe caregivers be less attuned to their kids, less available. And because neurodivergence is heritable, our parents themselves can be neurodivergent and have their own attachment difficulties and also struggle to cope with parenthood or showing up for us because of their own neurodivergent related challenges and their own attachment experiences. So we're less resilient as a whole, and we're more predisposed to not know what to do with our stress, what to do with our trauma when it shows up and when it becomes a source of unease or misery for us. And what we're doing when we dump, in part, is healthy. We are trying to co-regulate to seek regulation through healthy relationships with others, but we don't know how to put boundaries on what we're sharing. And so we might put an excessive amount of emphasis on, dumping those experiences, so-called dumping, on other people without realizing that we need to maybe tailor it a little bit to our audience, maybe gauge whether the person is receptive and able to and has the emotional bandwidth to do what we're asking them to do, whether they can consistently do that, or if they start to develop compassion fatigue, if we're overusing that privilege of sharing with somebody else. And we might share too much, too soon, and to the wrong person. And we might be outsourcing something that we essentially need to develop, which is true. Co-regulation is fundamental to the human experience. We all need it, but we also have to have some capacity for self-regulation. So when we're always putting it back on the other person or somebody else in our orbit to help regulate us, it can become tiresome, but it's also maladaptive because it doesn't teach us to actually manage our feelings. Granted, as somebody who's a therapist who's done a lot of self-work to figure out how to self-regulate, I know my inordinate amounts of anxiety can peak over sudden things and I can perseverate, and it takes me needing to seek somebody out to snap me out of it. Hearing somebody else grounding me with their advice, their feedback, their more objectiveness, their perspective, it can help me get out of it. So I don't think there's anything wrong with accessing it. I often access that support, but I'm also conscious of the things I mentioned to kind of pick my timing and my audience and be selective about it. Now, trauma dumping sometimes it's a bonding experience for many of us because we all have a hoard of complex trauma that is a source of common experience among us. So we might find that sharing those experiences helps us connect with others because we're like, oh my God, you experienced that too. It's universal as well. Between us, it's universal. And so we have a point of reference, and it can be a source of connection and mutual understanding and empathy and compassion. And it helps because if you know, if you've experienced complex trauma, it's so heartening to be in the company of other people who can mirror that and understand intimately the challenge that comes as a result of those experiences. So it may be in part a sharing of self because you're trying to build a bridge with somebody. But for people who haven't experienced complex trauma or have limited bandwidth to hear this kind of stuff, it can be very annoying, overwhelming, inconsiderate, insensitive, ill-timed, and they might find it really off-putting and, find you too much. If you are going to them and they don't really know you and you're like, help me with this thing, I'm feeling really anxious about this thing, they're like, I don't know if that's really my responsibility. If you go to them and say, oh, I had this really dark thing happen to me, here it is, and they're caught off guard by it and they're not expecting it, and you haven't built the foundation of a relationship for it to bear the weight of that confession or that sharing, that interaction can collapse and that relationship can be destroyed or can never fully form because you kind of hamstrung it from the beginning by overly sharing too much too soon. And I know I struggle with that as an ADHDer. There's a lot of impulsivity to want to share whatever comes to the top of my mind, and I have associative thinking as a result of my neurodivergence. I want to be like, oh, you said this makes me think of this, I want to share that. And sometimes it bypasses some of the checks and balances that I've developed to make sure that I'm not oversharing, and then I go, oops, put my foot in my mouth, said something I shouldn't have said, and I burnt that bridge and I put that person off. Have you struggled with this as a neurodivergent, seeking co-regulation, sharing common experiences, trying to bond or connect with other people, and it was perceived as trauma or anxiety dumping? The other person didn't really warm to it. They got kind of frustrated or annoyed. They judged you. Then they maybe excluded you or didn't want to continue interacting with you. I would love to hear all about your experiences.